On my 30th birthday, my mother said, "Everything started going wrong the day you were born." She said it while cutting my birthday cake in front of my wife and kids, like it was just another family story. "Before you came along, I had a perfect life, good job, nice apartment. Then you arrived and it all fell apart." My 8-year-old daughter looked confused and my wife grabbed her hand, but my mother kept going. "Lost my job because of maternity complications. Had to move back in with my parents. Your father left because he couldn't handle the stress of a baby. You were such a difficult child, always crying and getting sick." She handed me a slice of cake like she hadn't just blamed me for her entire life falling apart. "Mom, stop, not in front of the kids." But she waved me off like I was being sensitive. They should know their family history, how their grandmother sacrificed everything for their father, who brought nothing but misfortune. My son asked what misfortune meant, and my mother jumped at the chance to explain. "It means bad luck, sweetie. Like when your dad was 5 and I was finally going to get married again, but he got pneumonia the week before the wedding, and my fiancé said he couldn't handle a sick stepchild and left." I remembered that pneumonia. She'd left me alone for hours while she went out, and I'd gotten caught in the rain walking to the neighbor's house for food. Or when he was in high school and I was up for a promotion but had to miss the final interview because he got suspended for fighting. She didn't mention the fight was because kids were calling me trash because she'd spent my school clothes money at the casino. "Mom, you need to leave." My wife stood up, but my mother wasn't done. "See? Even now he's kicking out his own mother. This is what I mean by bad luck. I try to have a nice relationship with my grandchildren, but he ruins it." My daughter started crying and my mother pointed at her. "Look what you did. You made your daughter cry on your birthday, just like you cried on all of mine." That's when something clicked in my brain. "Wait, what do you mean I cried on all your birthdays?" She rolled her eyes. "You always got sick or hurt on my birthday, every single year. Food poisoning, broken bones, emergency room visits. Never once could I just enjoy my day." But I remembered those birthdays differently. "You mean like when I was 7 and got food poisoning because you left the potato salad out all day in the heat?" She glared at me. It wasn't that hot. My wife pulled out her phone and started looking something up. "Or when I broke my arm because you were drunk and told me to get your purse from the car and I fell down the stairs in the dark." My mother's face got red. "I wasn't drunk. I'd had a few birthday drinks like any adult." My wife showed me her phone. She'd found my old medical records online through the patient portal I'd given her access to. "These aren't accidents. These are neglect." She scrolled through years of emergency room visits. Dehydration, malnutrition, untreated infections, broken bones with delays in treatment. My mother stood up, knocking over her coffee. "How dare you? I did my best with an unlucky child." But my wife kept reading. "Doctor's note here says child reported mother was at boyfriend's house when injury occurred. Another one says the child was home alone for approximately 6 hours." My mother grabbed her purse. "I don't have to listen to this, and I'm the victim here. My whole life was derailed by having a child." That's when my quiet 10-year-old son spoke up. "Grandma, if you didn't want a kid, why did you have one?" She spun around to face him. "I didn't have a choice, and it was different back then." But I knew that was a lie, too. "Yes, you did. Dad told me before he died. He said you got pregnant on purpose because your parents were going to cut you off financially if you didn't settle down. You thought a baby would get you money." She laughed, but it was bitter. "Your father was a liar. Just another way you brought bad luck. If you hadn't been born, I never would have met him." My wife stood up and walked to the door and opened it. "Get out. Don't come back. Don't call. Don't write. If you try to contact our children, I'll file a restraining order with these medical records as evidence of child abuse." My mother looked at me, waiting for me to defend her. I didn't say anything. The silence stretched out between us while my mother's face changed from waiting to angry. Her mouth got tight and her eyes went hard. She grabbed her purse off the coffee table and knocked over what was left of her coffee. The brown liquid spread across the table, but she didn't even look at it. She turned toward the door and started yelling that I was an ungrateful son who would regret choosing my wife over my own mother. Her voice got louder with each word. My wife walked past her and turned the deadbolt with a quiet click. My mother yanked the door open so hard it bounced against the wall. She stomped down the front steps, still yelling about how I'd turned my back on family. The door slammed and I heard her car start in the driveway. My legs stopped working and I dropped onto the couch. My whole body started shaking. 30 years of being told I was the problem fought against this weird feeling of relief in my chest. My hands were trembling and I couldn't make them stop. My daughter climbed into my lap and wrapped her small arms around my neck. She asked if Grandma was mad at us. Her voice was so small and scared, I had to swallow hard before I could answer. I told her that sometimes grown-ups say mean things when they're upset, but it wasn't her fault. None of this was her fault. My son sat down next to us on the couch. He leaned against my shoulder and said he didn't think Grandma was very nice to me when I was little. Something broke open in my chest when he said that. This 10-year-old kid could see what I'd spent my whole life making excuses for. My wife sat on my other side and put her hand on my knee. She suggested we have ice cream and watch a movie. We could make a new memory to replace the ruined birthday. My daughter perked up a little and asked if we could watch the cartoon about the talking cars. My son said that was a baby movie, but he'd watch it anyway. We moved to the family room and my wife brought out the ice cream while I found the movie. The kids curled up on either side of me, and we ate ice cream straight from the container with 3 spoons. That night, after the kids finally fell asleep, I found my wife at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She'd pulled up more of my medical records through the patient portal. She scrolled through page after page, and I watched over her shoulder. Every single emergency room visit had notes about delays in getting treatment. One doctor wrote that my explanation for a burn didn't match the injury pattern. Another noted that I appeared underweight and possibly malnourished. A nurse had documented that I was brought in for dehydration after being left home alone on a hot day. The pattern was right there in black and white. I sat down hard in the chair next to her. I remembered being so hungry in 3rd grade that I stole a sandwich from Tommy Smith's lunchbox. When the teacher called my mother, she told them I was a liar who made up stories for attention. I remembered the shame of being called a thief in front of the whole class. My mother never admitted she'd spent the grocery money at the casino that week. My phone started buzzing the next morning. Text after text from my mother. The first one said I'd broken her heart. The second said I was poisoning my children against her. The third said she'd sacrificed everything for me, and this was how I repaid her. I put the phone face down on the counter, but it kept buzzing. Over the next week, the messages kept coming. Some were angry. She called me selfish and cruel. Some tried to make me feel guilty. She said she was crying herself to sleep every night. She said she'd given up her whole life for me. I didn't respond to any of them, but each one made my stomach hurt. That old familiar guilt told me I was being mean to her, that I should apologize and make things right. My wife showed me her phone one morning while we were having coffee. She'd found my mother's social media posts. My mother had written a long post about how I'd cut her off from her grandchildren without any explanation. She painted herself as a heartbroken grandmother who just wanted to love her family. Several of her friends had commented with sympathy. My Aunt Hannah wrote that ungrateful children were the worst kind of heartbreak. Someone else said my mother deserved better. My wife took screenshots of everything. She opened a folder on her computer labeled Documentation and saved all the images there. The look on her face told me she was getting ready for something bigger than I understood yet. 2 weeks after the birthday party, my daughter's teacher called. She said my daughter was having trouble paying attention in class and seemed worried all the time. That same afternoon, my son's school counselor reached out. My son had gotten into an argument with another kid who said family was the most important thing. My son had yelled that some family members were mean, and you didn't have to be nice to mean people. The counselor wanted to talk about what was going on at home. My wife and I sat at the kitchen table that night and scheduled appointments with the school counselor for both kids. We needed to help them work through what happened with their grandmother. My Aunt Hannah called 3 days later. She asked if we could meet for coffee because she wanted to hear my side of the story. I didn't trust it, but I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop halfway between our houses. When I walked in, she was already sitting at a corner table. She looked tired and uncomfortable. She kept twisting her napkin in her hands. She admitted that my mother had always been hard to deal with, but the medical records my wife mentioned had made her think about some things she saw when I was growing up. Things she'd ignored or made excuses for. Hannah pulled out a folder from her purse. She told me that my mother borrowed $15,000 from her 5 years ago. My mother said it was for my medical emergency. She said I needed surgery and didn't have insurance. Hannah showed me the loan agreement with my mother's signature. But I was never sick that year. I'd never needed surgery. My mother had used my name to get money from family. My wife pulled out her phone and took pictures of the loan agreement. She added them to her documentation folder when we got home. She said we should probably check my credit report to see what else my mother might have done. I found Phoebe Chandler's name on a therapist directory website. She worked with family problems and childhood stuff. Her first available appointment was in 2 weeks. When I finally sat in her office, I just started crying. I told her about the birthday party and everything that came after. I told her about the medical records and the texts and the social media posts. She listened without interrupting and handed me tissues when I needed them. She said my mother's behavior fit something called narcissistic abuse. It's when a parent makes the child responsible for the parent's feelings and failures. She said it wasn't my fault. None of it was ever my fault. I left her office feeling like someone finally believed me, but also sad for the childhood I should have had. My phone rang during lunch the next Tuesday. It was my daughter's school. The secretary said my mother had shown up at pickup time and was trying to talk to my daughter through the fence. I left work immediately and drove to the school going 10 miles over the speed limit. When I got there, my mother was at the fence crying. My daughter stood on the other side looking confused and scared. My mother was telling her that Daddy was being mean and wouldn't let Grandma see her anymore. My daughter's teacher stood next to her with a hand on her shoulder. I walked up and my mother turned to me with tears running down her face. She reached through the fence toward my daughter. I stepped between them and told my mother to leave. My voice came out harder than I expected. Every bit of guilt I'd been feeling disappeared when I saw my daughter's scared face. My mother started to argue, but I told her again to leave or I'd call the police. She finally walked away but kept looking back like she expected me to change my mind. I drove straight to the lawyer's office from the school. My wife had already called ahead and explained the situation. The receptionist led me to a small meeting room where a woman in her 40s sat with my wife's documentation folder spread across the table. She introduced herself and asked me to walk through everything that happened. I started with the birthday party, and my voice shook when I described my mother blaming me for ruining her life in front of my kids. The lawyer took notes and didn't interrupt. When I got to the part about my mother showing up at the school, she stopped writing and looked up at me. She said the school incident was critical because it showed my mother was willing to violate boundaries and approach my children directly. She flipped through the medical records my wife had found and pointed out specific doctor's notes that documented neglect. She said we had a strong case for a protection order based on harassment, the school incident, and the pattern of emotional abuse going back to my childhood. I felt something shift in my chest when she said that. Taking concrete action felt empowering but also wrong somehow, like I was overreacting or being cruel to my own mother. The lawyer must have seen it on my face because she leaned forward and reminded me that protecting my children were my primary responsibility. She said my mother had already shown she would use my kids to manipulate me, and that wouldn't stop without legal intervention. We scheduled the restraining order hearing for 3 weeks out, and I signed the paperwork with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. My mother's social media campaign started that same night. My wife showed me the first post around 9 o'clock after the kids were in bed. My mother had posted a photo of me as a toddler sitting on her lap at Christmas. The caption said she missed her baby boy and didn't understand why he'd turned against her after everything she sacrificed. Within an hour, the post had 20 comments from her friends saying how sad it was when children forget what their parents did for them. The next morning, there were 3 more posts. One showed me at my high school graduation with a caption about how proud she was that day before I changed. Another was from my wedding with my mother in her dress standing next to me, talking about how she'd saved for months to afford that dress because she wanted to look nice for her son's special day. The third post was just text saying her heart was broken because her daughter-in-law had poisoned her son's mind, and now she couldn't see her grandchildren. My phone started ringing that afternoon. First, it was my mother's cousin asking what was going on and why I was keeping my mother away from the family. Then my uncle called saying he'd seen the posts and wanted to hear my side. I didn't know what to say to either of them. How do you explain 30 years of abuse in a 5-minute phone call to someone who only knows your mother's version of events? By the end of the week, I'd gotten messages from 7 different relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Most of them were asking questions, but a few were accusatory, saying I should be ashamed for treating my mother this way after she raised me alone. I realized I was going to lose most of my extended family over this. They'd known my mother their whole lives, and I was just the kid who supposedly caused all her problems. My wife came into the bedroom on Saturday morning holding her laptop with a strange expression on her face. She'd been going through our credit report like the lawyer suggested and found something. 2 credit cards were listed under my name that I'd never opened. Both were opened when I was 17, and both had been sent to collections years ago for non-payment. The balances were over $8,000 combined. My wife showed me the account details and the addresses matched places my mother had lived. I felt sick looking at the screen. My mother had opened credit cards in my name when I was still in high school and destroyed my credit score before I even knew what credit was. We drove to the police station that afternoon and filed a report for identity theft. The detective who took our statement was younger than me with tired eyes. He said this kind of financial abuse by parents were more common than people think. Parents have access to their kids' social security numbers and can open accounts without the kid knowing until the damage is done. He said he'd investigate the full scope of the fraud and see if there were other accounts we didn't know about yet. He asked if I wanted to press charges, and I hesitated because pressing charges against your own mother felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But my wife squeezed my hand and I said yes. My daughter's therapist called me into her office after the 3rd session. My wife was already sitting there looking like she'd been crying. The therapist said both of our children had been carrying fears they hadn't told us about. My daughter had been afraid of making me sad the way my mother said I made her sad. She'd been worried that if she was too much trouble, I might blame her for things going wrong like my mother blamed me. The therapist said my daughter admitted she sometimes didn't tell me when she was sick because she didn't want to be bad luck. I had to leave the office. I walked out to my car in the parking lot and sat in the driver's seat with the door closed. I cried so hard I couldn't breathe right. My mother's poison had reached my children even in the limited time they spent with her. My 8-year-old daughter had been hiding when she felt sick because she was afraid of being called bad luck. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually my wife came out and got in the passenger seat. She didn't say anything, just held my hand while I cried. My mother's posts got worse over the next 2 weeks. She posted a long message claiming I was keeping her grandchildren from her because my wife was controlling and manipulative. She said my wife had brainwashed me and turned me against my own family. She posted screenshots of the text she'd sent me with my non-responses as evidence that I'd been conditioned to ignore her. One of her friends shared the post with a comment about how dangerous controlling spouses can be and how they isolate their victims from family. Another friend shared it saying she'd pray for me to break free from the manipulation. I felt humiliated watching my family drama spread across social media where anyone could see it and judge me. People who didn't know the full story were sharing sympathetic comments about my poor mother being cut off from her grandchildren by her evil daughter-in-law. My wife wanted to respond and set the record straight, but the lawyer said not to engage. Any response would just feed into my mother's narrative and give her more ammunition. So we stayed silent while my mother painted herself as the victim to anyone who would listen. I got a message request on social media from someone named Craig Valdez. The name seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it until I opened the message. He said he was my neighbor from when I was little, and he'd seen my mother's posts. He said he remembered me and wanted me to know he'd be willing to provide a statement if it would help. I called him that night and we talked for over an hour. Craig was 10 years older than me and had lived next door until his family moved when I was 7. He remembered finding me in our yard one morning when I was 6 years old. I'd been soaking wet and shivering because it had rained overnight, and my mother had left me outside while she went to her boyfriend's house. Craig's mom had brought me inside and given me dry clothes and breakfast. He said his parents had talked about calling someone, but my mother came back before they decided what to do. She'd told them I'd snuck out while she was sleeping and she was so sorry they'd had to deal with me. Craig said he'd always wondered what happened to me, and seeing my mother's posts had made him angry enough to reach out. His testimony would provide outside verification of the neglect documented in those medical records. I thanked him and felt grateful for his unexpected support from someone who barely knew me, but remembered enough to know my mother was lying. The restraining order hearing was in a small courtroom with fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out. My mother sat on one side with a lawyer she'd hired. I sat on the other side with my wife and our lawyer. The judge was a woman in her 50s who looked like she'd heard every story there was to hear. I had to testify first about the birthday party and what my mother said to my kids. Then I described the school incident and how my mother had tried to talk to my daughter through the fence. My mother's lawyer asked me questions trying to make it sound like I was having a midlife crisis and taking it out on my mother. He asked if I was under stress at work and if my marriage was having problems. He suggested maybe I was looking for someone to blame for my own issues. Our lawyer objected and the judge told him to move on. Then the judge reviewed the medical records. She read through page after page of emergency room visits with doctor's notes about delays in treatment and signs of neglect. She looked at the financial fraud evidence showing the credit cards my mother had opened in my name. She read Craig's written statement about finding me alone and wet in the yard at 6 years old. Her expression got more stern with each document. When she finished reading, she asked my mother's lawyer if he had anything to add. He tried to argue that these were old incidents being taken out of context, but the judge cut him off. She granted a temporary restraining order requiring my mother to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my wife, my children, and our home. She scheduled a hearing for a permanent restraining order in 3 months. My mother started crying and saying this wasn't fair, but the judge was already standing up to leave. 2 days later, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was handwritten on lined paper in my mother's handwriting. She said she was dying of cancer and didn't have much time left. She said she wanted to reconcile before it was too late and make peace with me and meet her grandchildren one last time. She said the doctors had given her 6 months and she didn't want to die with this distance between us. My hand started shaking when I read it. Every instinct I had was screaming that I needed to call her and fix this before she died. I showed my wife and she looked at the letter for a long time without saying anything. Then she pulled out her phone and called my mother's doctor's office. She told them she was calling about a family member's cancer diagnosis and needed to verify information for insurance purposes. The receptionist put her on hold and came back 5 minutes later. There was no cancer diagnosis in my mother's file. My mother had been to the doctor 3 weeks ago for a regular checkup, and everything was fine. The fake terminal illness was just another manipulation tactic. My wife hung up and I felt anger replace the panic. I'd almost fallen for it. I'd almost broken the restraining order and put my kids at risk because my mother lied about dying. I brought the letter to my next therapy session with Phoebe. She read it carefully and then looked at me and said, this was proof I'd made the right decision. My mother would say anything to regain control over me, including making up a serious illness to exploit my compassion. Phoebe said the letter was actually a gift because it showed me exactly who my mother was when she didn't get what she wanted. She asked me to write a response letter that I wouldn't send, just to process my feelings. I spent an hour writing everything I wished I could say to my mother. I wrote that I deserved better than being blamed for her failures. I wrote that she'd had choices and she chose to hurt me over and over. I wrote that I was breaking the cycle for my children so they'd never feel the way she made me feel. When I finished, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying those words around for 30 years and finally put them down. Phoebe told me to keep the letter somewhere safe and read it whenever I felt guilty about the restraining order. My wife suggested we start new family traditions to replace the ones that involved my mother. She said we should have a do-over birthday party, just the 4 of us, to make better memories. We planned it for the following Saturday. My kids helped me bake a cake from scratch and we talked while we measured ingredients and mixed batter. My son asked what makes a family healthy, and I had to think about my answer. I told him healthy families don't blame each other for their problems. They support each other when things go wrong instead of making it worse. My daughter asked if we were a healthy family now, and I said we were working on it. We were learning together how to be the family we deserved. The cake came out lopsided and the frosting was messy, but my kids were proud of it. We ate dinner together and then cake and ice cream. My son said family means people who don't blame you for their problems. I realized my kids were learning boundaries I never had growing up. They were learning that love shouldn't hurt and family shouldn't make you feel small. That was worth more than any relationship with my mother could ever be. 3 months felt like both forever and no time at all. The court date arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring. My wife took the day off work and we sat in the courthouse waiting room watching other families cycle through their hearings. Some looked relieved when they came out. Others looked destroyed. I kept checking my phone even though I knew my mother couldn't contact me anymore. The bailiff called my name and we walked into the courtroom. My mother sat at the defendant's table with her lawyer, a tired-looking man in a wrinkled suit. She looked smaller than I remembered, older somehow, but her eyes still had that sharp, angry look when she saw me. The judge reviewed the evidence my wife had compiled, the medical records, the financial fraud charges, the fake cancer letter, the incident at the school, my mother's social media posts, the witness statement from my childhood neighbor, the police report about the identity theft. It took 20 minutes to go through everything and my mother's lawyer barely said anything in her defense. The judge asked my mother if she had anything to say for herself. She stood up and started talking about how ungrateful I was, how she'd sacrificed everything, how my wife had turned me against her. The judge cut her off after 2 minutes and told her to sit down. Then he granted the permanent restraining order. 500 feet minimum distance from me, my wife, my children, and our home. No contact of any kind. Violation would result in immediate arrest. My mother's face went red and she started yelling about how this was all my fault, how I'd ruined her life from the day I was born, how the court system was corrupt. The bailiff had to escort her out while she screamed. I sat there feeling this weird mix of relief and sadness wash through me. Relief that it was finally over, that my children were legally protected. Sadness for the mother I'd needed as a kid, but never had. My wife squeezed my hand, and we left through a different exit to avoid running into my mother in the parking lot. The detective called me 2 weeks later with the results of his financial investigation. My mother had opened 7 different accounts in my name over the past 15 years. Credit cards, store accounts, a personal loan, even a car loan that defaulted 3 years ago. The total came to just over $30,000 in fraudulent debt. She'd been using my social security number since I turned 18, opening accounts and maxing them out, then moving on to the next one when they went to collections. The detective said they had enough evidence to charge her with identity theft and fraud. Multiple felonies that could mean serious prison time if she was convicted. I met with a credit repair specialist that my lawyer recommended. She walked me through the process of disputing each fraudulent account with the credit bureaus. It would take months, maybe over a year, to get everything cleaned up and off my credit report. But she said my score would eventually recover once we proved the accounts weren't mine. I filed affidavits with each creditor explaining the identity theft and providing copies of the police report. Some companies were helpful. Others made it difficult, demanding more proof, threatening to sue me for the debt. My wife handled most of the phone calls because I'd start shaking whenever I had to explain what my mother had done. 6 months after that birthday party, things felt different in our house. Lighter somehow, like we'd all been holding our breath for years and could finally exhale. My daughter stopped having nightmares about making people sad. My son stopped asking if he was bad luck. We started having family therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in helping kids process toxic family dynamics. My daughter told the therapist that I was a good dad because I protected them and listened to their feelings instead of making them feel bad for having feelings. My son said he wasn't worried about being cursed anymore because he understood that Grandma was wrong about luck and blame. We established new family traditions to replace the ones that involved my mother. Friday movie nights where everyone got to pick the movie once a month. Saturday morning pancake competitions where we rated each other's cooking. Sunday game nights where we played board games until someone got too competitive and we all laughed about it. The kids could be silly without worrying about upsetting anyone. They could be loud. They could make mistakes without fear of being blamed for ruining everything. My wife and I watched them playing in the backyard one evening, and she said this was what childhood should look like. Joy without anxiety shadowing it. Freedom without walking on eggshells. I realized I was learning how to be a father by watching my kids be kids, seeing what they needed and giving it to them instead of repeating the patterns I'd grown up with. Almost a year after my 30th birthday, my wife and I sat on the porch watching our kids chase fireflies in the yard as the sun went down. The restraining order was still in place. My credit score had improved by 80 points as the fraudulent accounts got removed one by one. My mother had been convicted of identity theft and sentenced to 18 months in prison followed by probation. Some of my extended family still wouldn't talk to me. My Aunt Hannah sent a card on my birthday with a note saying she was sorry for not seeing what was happening when I was young. My uncle stopped responding to my calls. 3 cousins blocked me on social media. But the family I'd built with my wife and children felt solid in a way nothing in my childhood ever had. My son ran up to the porch holding a jar with 2 fireflies in it, asking if we could keep them overnight. My daughter was right behind him arguing that we should let them go because they'd be sad trapped in a jar. Normal kid stuff. Normal parent stuff. I was learning in therapy that I could be a good father exactly because I knew what a bad parent looked like. I knew what not to do, what not to say, how not to make my children feel. My wife leaned against my shoulder and said the kids seemed happy. I watched them debating about the fireflies, their faces lit up with excitement and the glow of the bugs, and I thought about how different their childhood was from mine. That was enough.